Hello and welcome. We are your hosts Sandesh and Anshuman. In each episode, we will pick one seemingly boring security topic and talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between. So join us for some fun, some conversations, and some super hot takes about all things security in the boring AppSec podcast. Hey Anshuman, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Sandesh?
Not not too bad, not too bad. Today though, we're going to talk about we're going to do part two of the bug bounty podcast. So episode three, we spoke a little bit about bug bounties. We spoke about the hunter's perspective, the bug bounty hunter's perspective, on how to get started, how to be respectful, how to kind of make money and still have fun while doing bug bounties. We also spoke a little bit about the program manager perspective. I think we alluded to it in a few places, but I think we should dig deeper on that, right? We should dig deeper on kind of the other side of the bug bounty program, which is, let's say you are in a security team and your company does not have a bug bounty program and you're considering one, right? So let's kind of take like do that journey, right? So from how do we get from there, you're thinking about bug bounties, but you're not sure, to kind of having like a mature bug bounty program where you're genuinely getting value, right? So let's talk about that journey today. So Anshuman, quick question to start off, to kick us off: when should you not have a bug bounty program?
I need to think about that for a second. When should you not? I think if you feel like you're not prepared to start a bug bounty program, that's when you know that you shouldn't run it, to be honest, right? If I were to dig into that a little bit more, what I'm trying to say is generally product security teams, have varied levels of maturity. Either they are they're like a brand new product security team, or they've been on the scene for a few years. They have some basic fundamental things going on, like threat modeling, design reviews, SAST, dash, whatnot, right? And then you start thinking about exposing your applications infrastructure and inviting external researchers to hack on it. That's generally the trend I've seen. Now, having said that, I've also seen companies that jump into bug bounty program as the first thing that they do. My opinion there is slightly skewed. I don't think a company should be doing that, but having said that, I've seen bug bounty programs actually being really successful that way, because what happens is programs launch their program, right? And then as soon as they receive the initial influx of reports, so let's say they receive 50 reports on first day, and by the end of first week they have about 500 reports, right? After that they just completely pause, or they just stop responding to the researchers, because they have so much backlog, they have so much stuff to look at. And generally, like, there's no ethics. I mean, there are ethics that programs supposed to follow and whatnot, but it's okay, right? Like, if you have too many reports, if you don't think you'll be able to pay each and every hunter, right, the recommendation from platforms is to keep the program on hold for a few days, months, and then get back to it, right? So I think that if you are thinking about it from that perspective, yes, you can run a successful bug bounty program. But yeah, like, mileage may vary, so every company operates it differently.
No, I think you're right, and we'll get to a little more about preparedness for bug bounty programs, right? But I think like you said, your mileage on bug bounty programs really vary depending on what kind of a company you are, right? So my sense is that if a lot of what you build up, a lot of products that you have are readily accessible through the internet to your customers, then I think you're right. Bug bounty programs make sense. Now we can discuss on whether that should be first, second, third, eighth, what do you need to do before and all that. But it inherently makes sense to do that, because your users, I mean, the kind of bug bounty hunters who kind of sign up on these platforms and try to hunt for bugs are very similar to your users as well, in the sense that they access things to a website or a mobile app, they sign up, start using it. Makes a lot of sense, right? But I do think there may be companies where there may be a tech company, they may have a lot of software, but it may not be some things which are used or available widely. For instance, you may be a company who is not a SaaS product and you're a software company, and all your deployments are in customers' environments and used as internal applications, right? So, I mean, we don't see that too much these days with the whole advent of
Yeah.
SaaS, but there's still many companies which do that. So, if you're that kind of a company, then bang for the buck you get from bug bounty programs is like much lower. I mean, you'll still have a website, you'll still have a few internet facing applications, which you should still go for, but your crown jewels is not something that your bug bounty hunters can add a lot of value on. So I would say that for such programs, maybe bug bounty programs are not top of the funnel. Like, you can think about that after, like you said, after you have like a really mature program and you can use it as a way to engage with these researchers, etc. But I think a simple bug bounty program will not help there. You'll probably have to have something a lot more involved, where you can create sandbox environments, people can jump in, you can teach them about your environment and so on and so forth. So I would say that I agree with you. I would just add a nuance that depending on on the kind of company you are and what software you build and own, bug bounty programs may have different mileage as well. But I think by and large, you're right. I mean, unless you're prepared, there's no reason not to have a bug bounty program at all. Like there's no company which should absolutely not have a bug bounty program, in my opinion, right? I think most
Mhm.
companies should. So if that's the case, and we assume that you're working for a company where you want to have a bug bounty program, and let's say you have some kind of an application security team, you do some amount of testing. It's not perfect, nobody's perfect, right? How do you go about this? How do you kind of get started, thinking about and starting a bug bounty program?
Yeah. Before I can answer that, I think I slightly disagree with you on, like, depending upon the company. So I think, again, please correct me if wrong, but what I understood is, if you're a company that is not necessarily like selling SaaS services, you said that the recommendation, since it's not exposed to customers as such, like the customers would install it in their environments, right? Those kind of companies can, the ROI of bug bounties might not be there. In my experience, what I've seen is, if such companies do have bug bounty program, the ROI is actually much higher. And the reason why I say that is because the researchers who operate on these programs are the kind of researchers that like to dig deep into, the actual code base, the actual so let's say, if a company XYZ, it sells appliances which you can install in your AWS environment, right? And then if the company gives access to the code base of this appliance to the researchers, there are some researchers who are pretty good at doing code analysis, reading through the code, right? And the kind of bugs they find there is freaking crazy, right? Like, I want to give a shout out to this guy who I know. His name is Alex Chapman. He is known to find some of the most impactful bugs in this industry, right? Like, RC is pretty usual for him. And I've seen some of his reports as well when I was a program owner. Yeah, like his one report is equivalent to 50 reports of all other researchers, right? So yeah, I think, again, it kind of depends. If you are starting a bug bounty program, and if you're a company that is not necessarily selling like SaaS services, how are you going about it, right? Like, are you giving access to the code base? Are you giving the researchers what they need or not?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I had never thought about giving like core access to researchers and stuff. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
That seems like a really advanced use case, right? We should talk more about that. But yeah, that's
yeah,
interesting. I had never thought about it that way. My sense always was that you're trying to mimic a hacker, and even if you're selling
yeah,
appliances which can't be deployed anywhere, then how would they even access it? But you're right. With
yeah,
enough effort, and if you're able to kind of simulate an environment, give them access to code bases, it may add a whole lot of value. Very interesting. I did not
yeah,
think about that. So
yeah.
that's
No,
the for me.
it's a rabbit hole that we can go into. Yeah. But again, like, coming back to your question about, how one should go about starting a program, I think the way I've seen bug bounty programs scale really well is to start really small, right? And by starting small, what I mean is, you start with a limited scope. You start with a limited set of researchers who you can ask the platforms like HackerOne or Bugcrowd to recommend. I think they have matured enough to a point where they know if somebody's good at hacking mobile applications or somebody's good at hardware. So I think starting small gives you that idea of, like, look, if these researchers who are good at finding their stuff, right, and you have given them only a limited amount of scope with high incentives, I think it's good to get an idea of what is the attack surface out there that you might not be aware of, right? So all the unknown unknowns, once you do that, right, once you run that for like 6 months or maybe more, once you see the volume of reports slow down, right, I think at that point you can consider either expanding the pool of researchers. I know HackerOne has this thing where they invite a handful set of researchers every week, and then they gradually keep scaling up and right. So I think that's one way. But the eventual, the aim is to have a wide scope program exposed to everybody, right? Like, I think Yahoo is a good example. I don't know if their scope has changed, but generally when I've hacked on Yahoo, their scopes are wildcard domains, and everything is fair game, right? So yeah, I think it's important to know that if you're thinking about starting a bug bounty program, do it in phases. Smaller private program, then expanding the scope, and then eventually go all out.
No, I agree with you. I think that's a solid roadmap. But let's take a -1 to 0 approach as well, right? So even before you start a private program, how do you kind of convince stakeholders within your company to do this, right? So I mean, I'm
Uh,
pretty sure the security team is probably sold on this. I mean, there's enough literature around bug bounty programs now that people kind of understand why it's important. But like I think we spoke about this a little bit last time as well. But your CFO, your head of engineering, your incident response team, teams. For them, this sounds crazy, right? Actually
Yeah.
giving folks money to a custodian hack for you, right? And then you don't know who they're doing it. There's no prior intimation that they're going to test something. There's no real rules on what tools they can run. I mean, there are rules on what tools they can run, but there's no way you can enforce that. There's no control on the
Yeah.
environment. I mean, you can obviously have some control on on the environment they test in, but that's only once you reach an advanced stage. When you start off, you have to keep it simple, like you said, start small, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you go about, so one, I guess, two-part question here, and I'm thinking through this as I ask, who are the stakeholders you should really consider getting on board before you start a program, and kind of, how do you go about doing it?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll actually answer this question through an example. I think which will give more context. So when I was with Atlassian, Atlassian has this app store where you can think of it like if you use Jira, right? You can install third-party applications on Jira. Same thing with Confluence and whatnot, right? So and all these third-party apps which you install on Jira and Confluence, they are actually built by third-party vendors, right? And these vendors are all over the world, right? So when I joined Atlassian, I was one of the first hires on the ecosystem security team. So our mandate was to make sure that third party ecosystem of Atlassian was secure, right? We started a bunch of things around this, right? But one of the things that we did at that point of time, Atlassian was using Bugcrowd as the platform, right? So we use Bugcrowd to basically run a campaign of sorts. And this campaign, what we did was, right, we ran this campaign, I believe, again, I don't remember the exact number of weeks, but maybe 2 to 3 weeks, right? And then we paid for the all the rewards that the hunters found on these third party vendors app code, right? This was Atlassian's way of incentivizing and showing value to these third party vendors, like, look, a bug bounty program is important, it's going to find you good stuff, high impactful stuff, and if you don't trust in this process, if you are skeptical about it, we'll pay for the initial few weeks. And then if you are convinced, if you start seeing value at that point, you have the option of either continuing the program on your end or stopping it completely, right? So I think, and I believe that was really successful because the vendors really saw the value from it. We had some very great bugs, right? And we also found vulnerabilities in like Atlassian's third party framework as well, right? Which these third party vendors use to build apps on. So I think really, convincing stakeholders is very difficult, especially when you're asking them to spend money
Yeah.
on something that they don't want to know about it, right? Because they built it. So I think showing value is tricky. One way is to, just kind of do this vulnerability disclosure program, or we call it VDP. You're not paying the researchers anything, you just are rewarding them kudos or whatever. But then again, you get what you pay for, right? So the quality of researchers there is not going to be good. So that's been my experience.
No, I agree with you. I mean, the Atlassian example is very interesting, right? I mean, hopefully most bug bounty programs don't have to convince external stakeholders as well, in addition to internal stakeholders. But that
Yeah.
sounds like a tough nut to crack. Super impressed that Atlassian was able to do that. But I really like your idea on the vulnerability disclosure program. I think that's where everybody should start, right? You have a vulnerability
Yeah.
disclosure program. Have a slash security page on your website, on
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
GitHub page, wherever it is, and then just start getting used to engaging with researchers, right? Because the one thing you realize when you start engaging with researchers is that there's a lot of, to be honest, right, the signal to noise ratio
Mhm.
is not very high when you start off, right? If you're doing, like, if you're spending on a bug bounty platform and all that, then sure, then maybe they kind of take some of the hit and they're able to kind of give you more, better results. But when you create a vulnerability disclosure program, you will get a lot of findings which are not real, and you'll have to learn to deal with it, right? But I think that helps you kind of grow a muscle on what kind of vulnerabilities can be found. And also, this kind of, it's a slightly lower pressure way of getting things started. You don't have to go ask for approvals without data. You don't have to kind of think about budgeting. You don't have to kind of, there's no pressure of a platform, etc. But what you can do is, let's say a researcher reaches out to you, they submit a bug. You're not focusing on the periphery. You're only focusing on what's the bug. Is it a real bug? And then you work with the engineering teams to solve it, right? Now, let's say you do like 8 or 10 of these. Now we have data that there is value in engaging with third-party researchers, and when you engage well with them, there is value added, and our security posture has improved. Once you have the data, right, it's a lot easier to convince non-engineering stakeholders. So your finance team, your CXO team, or whoever you need to get permission/budget from, they like to see data, and this really helps. And it also kind of gets the
Yeah.
engineering teams excited because right now you had like a lower pressure way of handling this, right? So I think that's absolutely the way to go. The -1 to 0 journey, I think, should be a vulnerability disclosure program with no money involved. Maybe there's swag and stuff involved, but
Yeah.
shipping t-shirts across the world is not straightforward. If you're an Indian
Yeah.
company shipping t-shirts to Brazil, you will learn a lot about import export laws that you don't want to learn,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I,
Right.
I, I just want to add a, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to add to that. So in my experience, running a VDP program is good just to show that you care for security and you welcome researchers to report security vulnerabilities to you via an official means, right? That is what VDP program to me is. I say that because I've not really seen good impactful vulnerabilities come through a VDP program, just because folks who are good at finding good stuff, they want to get paid for whatever they find, right? So yeah, I think if you are a big company, right, and if you just want to get your name out there saying that you care for security and you want to fix and you want to do the right thing by the customers, I think VDP program is great, right? But having said that, I think the expectation should be pretty, at least folks who are running these kind of programs, they should have the expectations set clear, in the sense that they're not gonna get high
Yeah.
impactful bugs out of
No, no,
it, right?
I'm with you. I think VDP serve two purposes, right? So one, it's the bare minimum, like you said. That's the first thing. I mean, that's the bare minimum you can do as a tech company, as a company who owns software, is to have a disclosure program so that there's a formal way of
Mm,
communicating with you. The second thing it also does is it acts as a nice little catch-all. So if you think about a bug bounty program, you can use it as like a precise weapon. You can say, hey, I'll give you more bounty for this subdomain because we really care about this. This is a new product we're launching, so we want like a campaign on it. So you can use you can use a lot of precision and kind of specific strategy on your bug bounty programs. Whereas your VDP can be your catch-all. So you can still have
yeah.
star.companyname.com as your VDP scope, but your bug bounty scope can be a lot narrower. So it kind of so in general, I think the vulnerable disclosure program, I think, is like, one, it's bare minimum, you have to do it, and two, it allows you to kind of have like a very broad scope, a very broad rules of engagement, very relaxed rules of engagement as well, because you kind of, okay, you're not handing out bounties, so you don't have to worry about the finance aspects of it. But you're right, once
Yeah.
you have like a mature program, the best kind of bug bounty program, in my head, is the one that looks like a VDP. It's the one which looks like, which is star.companyname.com, same bounties
Yeah.
for everything, and so on and so forth. But that's wishful thinking, right? So until you get there, I think it's good to kind of start with the VDP and then eventually kind of get to bug bounties.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
I just want to highlight one more thing there. So I think one more thing that is good with VDB programs is that it will help you establish a process of handling vulnerabilities, right? Like if you don't have a VDB program and if a thing comes in, you absolutely have no idea what to do with it. On the other hand, if you do have a VDB program, if a vulnerability report comes in, you know that you're supposed to have a process of how to report, how to respond back to the researcher, how to get the actual vulnerability triage and fixed by the right team. So I think building that process itself, if you have that process already, VDB program
Yeah,
is just another step. I don't think
sure.
there's any additional effort required.
Fair enough, and I think finally it's just the right thing to do. I think, like I said, that's the bare
Yeah.
minimum. If you're a tech company and you don't have a VDP, we are judging you. Right. Anyway, okay,
Yeah.
so right, okay, so we are, so we've kind of established kind of, when not to have a program, when to have a program, and kind of, we spoke a little bit of convincing internal stakeholders and stuff, right? I think in general, if you're going to go to non-technical audiences to kind of get some amount of data, sorry, get some amount of funding or approvals, or just get them on the same page, it's useful to go get some data. I know we can talk a little bit more about this, but in general, I think it's useful to kind of talk about, hey, if vulnerability that was reported through a VDB, what would have happened if a hacker discovered it and they had not reported, right? Like, what could have been the consequences? If you can explain this in like business risk terms, that would be
Mhm.
something kind of which helps you convince your stakeholders, right? I think your engineering stakeholders, you need to focus more on just a way to find bugs and a way to fix bugs, right? But for your non-engineering folks, I think you need to like really talk about impact, and how it's
Yeah.
way harder to kind of scale the security team to find every kind of vulnerability versus having a
Yeah.
program like this kind of like really helps, right? And you can also talk about how
Yeah.
it kind of simplifies a bug bounty program, really simplifies this whole process of engaging with researchers, just because a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of paying researchers, managing them, inviting them, selling the idea, or inviting researchers to participate, all this is handled by the platform. So you pay a platform fee and
Yeah.
it kind of makes it life a lot simpler to you. So even if you don't have someone who's run a bug bounty program before, like when I ran a bug bounty program for the first time, I had no experience running it before. I understood the ecosystem, but I never run something like
Mhm.
this. But it was a lot easier for me because that partnered with the platform, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
one way to think about stakeholders.
V-
Cool.
uh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So one additional thing for convincing stakeholders, one thing that I've seen work really well is if you really want to convince your VP or EMs of like why running a bug bounty program could be useful. POC, right? POCs or proof of concept is the way to go, right? Like if you can show, give you a good example, XSS or cross-site scripting, right? Most of the bug reports that come in, or even what internal product security engineers find, is just the alert box, right? You, if you're able to show the alert one, it means that it is vulnerable, right? How many times have folks actually gone and try to show an exploit where, you steal the session cookies, you exfiltrate it, and then you take over the account completely, right? I know it's these days it's slightly difficult just because of other protections, but if you're able to show that POC to a VP, right? Like, look, I can take over your account right here and there, and this is why having a bug bounty program is important. I think that POC goes a long way.
Absolutely. No, I'm with you. Okay, so we've kind of spoken about kind of like stakeholder management and convincing stakeholders, etc. Right? So how do you think about the launch? Right? So I mean, you did speak about kind of like going from PDP to private to slow public and then broad public, right? Is that kind of the right approach? Like typically, how long does that take? Is that like a few weeks, few months, few years? What do those things depend on?
Funny because I haven't been in a company long enough to have seen all the phases. Like I've been in different companies which have gone through different phases, but typically what I've seen is, the private programs can I've seen companies run private programs for years, right? Like I think there's no rule that you should run a private program for 6 months or a year, right? It really depends, right? Like if you have the bandwidth to handle the reports, if your engineering is building features and products at a very fast pace, and you constantly ship new features, and you don't have good security controls at the framework layer, yeah, I think sticking to private is the best way, right? Because you will constantly have a barrage of vulnerabilities, and you just always we end up dealing with those issues. However, if your eventual aim is to go public one day, right, I think it helps to at least scope it out, right? So let's say we run a private program for 6 months, we expand it for the other 6 months, and then after a year we go all out, right? So I think I've seen all kinds of timelines work for different companies.
No, that's interesting. I think another thing to think about is what your regulatory slash compliance obligations are, right? When you and what your bug bounty program settings are going to be, right? So for once somebody discovers a vulnerability and lets you fix it, in many platforms they allow you to make the bug report public, and which as a
Hmm.
security researcher is very good. It kind of makes sense, but you may have internal obligations to say, hey, if you discovered a vulnerability which is now visible to a third party, which is to an external party, you may also have to go report that to your regulator. And every country is different, every industry is different. So you need to think on those lines as well. If you're in a very highly regulated industry, the cost of running a public bug bounty program may be very high from a regulatory pressure perspective. In which case, it may not be worth the effort, to be honest, right? That in that way, you may want to kind of focus more on private bug bounties for much longer period of time. Have a lot more engagement with those specific people participating in your program, but not make most things public. That's possible too. But in general, I think not every company, most companies are not that highly regulated, and if you're a company which is not that, then you don't need to really worry too much about it. But that's something definitely to kind of think about. Okay, so one other thing, right? So once you kind of start a bug bounty program, whether private or public, the first thing that I experienced is just like a whole barrage of reports, right? And
Hmm.
one of the reasons you start a bug bounty program is because you don't have unlimited bandwidth, right, to do the testing. If you had, like, I don't know, one pen tester for every three developers, right, you don't need a bug bounty program, probably, right? You can just keep pen testing all the time, and you'll probably get those, assuming you have access to good talent, right? But that's not the case in most companies. In most cases, you don't have access to the talent, and that's why you use bug bounty programs. Now, that argument makes sense until you hit with 100 reports on day
Hmm.
one, and now all your bandwidth
Hmm.
goes into less interesting work, which is triaging these reports, right? So,
Hmm.
how do you think about triaging? How should you set up your team internally to do triages? When is the right time to
Yeah.
think about triage services? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, two thoughts there. Well, first is you can obviously pay these platforms, HackerOne, Buckrowd, to do the triaging. I think that really helps because I want to say they tend to do a good job in weeding out all the noise from the actual reports, right? And I've seen that work really well. So that's one option. If you are okay to pay these platforms to do the triaging for you, then I think you should do it. The other, I think, and again, coming back to my last example, right? We expected a whole bunch of reports because there was a whole bunch of vendors which we ran programs on. What my team did was we built some kind of an automation system, right, where not the triaging part but everything after the triaging, right, like setting up the severity, figuring out how much to reward, figuring out which class, right, figuring out which team or which vendor this bug goes to and how they should fix it. All of the other part was completely automated to a point where as soon as a report came in, right, we triage it to see if it is a false positive or not, and then the rewarding piece, the alerting piece, all of that was completely automated, right? So I think that is one way of handling these reports. And then if you sort of have some kind of a hybrid version where you are paying the platform to do the triaging and then you also have some automation built, I think that is awesome. Like if you can have that kind of a system, that is really nice.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. That's really interesting, right? So I think the approach we kind of took was that initially we did not subscribe to the triage service just because we kind
Mhm.
of wanted to have a little more empathy for the researchers to understand what kind of things they're submitting. We also wanted to kind of really understand kind of the wheat from the chaff, like what kind of reports look good, what don't look good, get some data, etc. Right? So we did that, but 3 months later we're like, yeah, we're done with this, right? This is not a very good use
Right.
of our time, right? Which I think is a little bit of a double-edged sword because it kind of increases the cost of operating a bug bounty program now, right? Because you pay the platform fee and you pay like a triage service, and of course, there's always a chance of false negatives with triage, where they may
Yeah,
think it's not a
absolutely, all the
real
time.
vulnerability, and but in your
Yeah.
particular context, it may be real, right?
Right.
So that is definitely a kind of a double-edged sword. But yeah, triage is going to be with you forever. But one the good news is that security folks are very good. Like good security folks are very good. The whole needle in a haystack type thing, right? We are used to
Yeah.
tools giving us 90% false positives, right? And so
Yeah.
so from that perspective, in general, I think we have mental models and we are kind of primed to kind of handle that. But yeah, whenever it makes sense, I would highly recommend subscribing to the triage service as well. And maybe even if you do subscribe to the triage service, I would still say have spot check the triage done by
Yeah.
the provider every now and then to kind of make sure that things are going okay. Okay, so you touched upon something else, which is kind of part of my next question. So let's just kind of talk about that, right? So if you think about the whole life cycle, right, we kind of spoke about everything from an outside in perspective, where you're submitting the bug report, you're triaging, you're communicating, and all that. But what happens internally, right? So you spoke about a little bit about the automation, right? So can you double click on that a little bit? Like what happens between the time you receive a report and let's say you triaged it and it's a real finding to the time the bounty is paid? Like what at a high level is
Mhm.
kind of the flow there, and how do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, it's all chaos basically. I'm just kidding. Yeah, once a vulnerability has been triaged and it turns out to be a true positive, so let's go with that flow, right? First, I think the immediate step after that is to assess the impact and the risk to the company, to that particular product, feature, whatever. And for that, again, every company has different standards, different frameworks. There's like CVSS. I think Zoom has their own way of doing like severity assessments, right? So it is important to understand the impact of a particular vulnerability which has been reported, right? I know Facebook and Google, they don't just stop at what is being reported. They actually go and do extensive research and investigation to figure out is there something more to it, right? And I think that is really important, is to understand the impact. So once you do that, once you have a good understanding of if it is something high, a critical P0, whatever, right? I think at that point you need to figure out how much to reward, right? And even before you decide what to reward, right, I think there's that confusion where should you be rewarding the full amount or should you wait for the bug to be fixed, right? So all those things come into the picture. And I think we might have spoken about this before, but I believe in pay on triage at least some portion of the overall reward. So for example, if you get reported an RCE and if according to your program scope you are saying you're going to pay $20,000 for an RCE, right? And if it turns out to be a true positive but you still don't know the actual impact, right? It might be on like an isolated server which is not exposed and all of that. You still pay a portion of the $20,000 and then you do your investigation and then you figure out, okay, it's not that bad, and then you come back to it. So that's generally the trend. Yeah, I you have something to say? Yeah,
Okay, no,
go
that
ahead.
makes sense. Just one kind of follow up question on that, right? So I think we've already spoken about kind of the bounty amounts and all that, but when you get a vulnerability, so let's say two scenarios, right? So one is you find a vulnerability on a public facing application from an internal pen testing team, and let's say there's another scenario where a similar bug is found by a bug bounty hunter on a public bug bounty platform, right? So it's not a private program; it's actually a public program. Internally, when you're tracking these vulnerabilities and you're working with your engineering teams to get it fixed, is one higher priority than the other because somebody outside the company knows about it now, or do you kind of treat the researchers as your internal folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the external report has to get more priority, obviously, because now it is known by somebody who's not your employee, right? And I think, again, in my experience, I've seen that generally is the case, right? Because, again, if somebody hears that, okay, somebody has found an issue in our systems who does not work for us, yeah, we have to go fix that because there's always that skepticism that whoever has found is going to go and disclose it and whatnot, right? So I think there is some risk there, and because of that risk, I think the priority of the external report obviously treats it higher.
This usually brings up an interesting conundrum, right? So does that mean, I mean, I know the answer to this question, but and it's a little rhetorical, but I'll ask anyway. So it just means that when a hunter, does that essentially mean that your bug bounty hunter is at like a higher plane than your internal pen tester, right? Because the internal pen tester is like, hey
Yeah,
man, I told you so, and yet
yeah,
you
yeah,
only listen when somebody outside tells you, right? It's kind of a bit of
exactly.
a dangerous precedent, because if you think about maturity of application security programs, you're always like, don't go after exploitability, have better secure coding standards, make sure that you do things right instead of waiting for something to be exploitable. But then at the same time, the same security team also says that if you have a report from outside, then and it's exploitable, then it has a higher priority, right? I mean, I know this is
So
like a classic security team conundrum, but how do you kind of
yeah,
square?
yeah. No,
Yeah.
I actually I totally agree with that, right? I think one thing that has worked for me is if you as an internal security engineer, if you find that same issue, right, it is on to you how much noise you create around that, right? If so, let's say I find a RC internally, I report it to the engineering team, and the engineering team is not taking me seriously just because they know I'm a security engineer and I just found it, right? So at that point, right, if the security engineer is experienced enough, or they know how to deal with such cases, I think the onus is on the security engineers to either escalate or try to bring more attention to it. And I've succeeded in if I've taken that approach in the past, just because like if you report an issue to an engineering team, and if you ask them to fix, and if you don't follow up, or if you don't care for that issue deep enough, the engineering team most likely also will not care, right? So I think, yeah, like there are ways to treat your internal teams with the same priority. It really depends.
No, I think that's a good point, right? It kind of goes back to the episode we did on when you're the first security hire, right? It's really downstream
Uh-huh.
from your organization culture, right? In some companies,
Hmm.
the only way to get attention is to make noise, right?
Yeah.
I would say it's like a hard culture to kind of work in, but to each their own. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you can have frameworks in place to make it easier and stuff, that's important. But as I've spent more time in the security industry, I've kind of come to the unfortunate conclusion exploitability matters, right? I mean, because there's just
Oh
so
yeah.
many potential vulnerabilities everywhere, that the high horse that I was on 7 8 years ago, saying, hey, don't worry about exploitability, as long as you do everything in a secure way, you'll never have exploitable
Oh,
vulnerabilities, which is absolutely
yeah.
true theoretically, but in reality it's like a freaking endless treadmill at 10 miles an hour while drinking coffee and responding to emails, right? You'll never get there, right? It's a great ideal to have, but you'll never get there, and therefore exploitability matters. And if exploitability matters, then exploitable by who becomes important. And if you know that there's a researcher out there outside the company who's able to do it, then it just has to have higher priority, right? But you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. But you're right on getting attention from engineering on security defects can be an episode on its own. So we'll kind of
Yeah.
talk
And
about that.
yeah, I just want to like sum it up. I think one way to go about this, right, like to
Okay.
make noise, is to have some kind of a risk assessment slash like severity assessment framework, right, which is agreed upon by everybody, right? So if you find something, and if you apply that framework to that issue, and if that turns out to be P0, then I
Hmm.
don't think anybody's going to argue against that, right?
Sure.
They'll have
Yeah.
questions as to why do you think, and then you can always defend yourself. So I think having the basic building blocks in a place is also important.
I'm with you. Absolutely with you, right? Okay, so that kind of makes sense to me. So the next thing I kind of want to talk about a little bit is, how do you think about bounties, right? Right, like like is $1,000 too much? Is $100,000 too much? Where do you draw the line on? How do you? I mean, do you have any frameworks in your mind on how do you kind of come up with the budget, at least for the first time? So the platform fee is the platform fee. That's fine. But when the first time you're trying to kind of request for a bounty pool, you start with $100,000. Do you start with $10,000? How do you kind of think about this?
Yeah, man. I don't know if I'll have a good answer to this. I can just go based on what I've seen, because I know this is like a running debate. How much vulnerability is worth. Yeah, because I don't think there's like a number that anybody can assign. Every industry, every bug is different. I think generally what I tend to do is to sort of see what are some good programs out there, right? Same scale, like similar scopes, similar applications, stacks, and whatnot, and then see how much they pay for, let's say, RCE or XSS, whatever, right? I think that to me is like a good baseline, because you know that if that's a good running program and researchers really enjoy working on that and they have these rewards, you should try to aim for this. If not same, like similar reward ranges, so to speak, right? And I've seen that work well in. most programs I've looked at.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think so. While you were saying it, I was thinking about it, right? So it's kind of like when you're selling a product, right? How do you come up with pricing for your product, right? And there
Yeah.
are typically like two or three different ways of doing it. I think there are a few sales books which talk about this, which I have to read now because I run a company and not just do cool security things, right? I mean, the one way
Mhm.
of looking at it is cost plus. Is like, if you had to find this bug, how much would this cost you, right? And then how many hours did the researcher spend on
Yeah.
it? Multiply that with some kind of hourly rate, and then give them
Yeah.
a markup on that, right? So that's one way to do it. Very hard to do because everyone's hourly rate is different. Maybe you can just benchmark against your team's hourly rate, and then so that's one way of doing it, which is the cost plus model. The other thing is to kind of figure out what the market rate for these vulnerabilities are, which is exactly what you said. Like a money leak vulnerability for a bank is probably worth a lot more money than some other kind of vulnerability, right? So you can go look at how others are doing it and kind of start from there, and then improvise over time. I'm sure there are kind of other ways. Or the third approach sounds a little mean is what is the least amount of money you have to pay to keep people interested, right? So
Yeah.
if that's $1,000, then just do $1,000 because why do 1,000
Yeah. That's true.
why do 1,100, right? Because my point is that in the end, the lesser you pay for bounties, the more number of vulnerabilities you can people can submit and you can pay for, and you don't have to de-throttle, like you don't have to throttle your program. But at the same time, if you don't get enough money, then the people are not coming in, right? So I think
Yeah.
one of these three approaches can work, but in reality, I think these are great for theoretical discussions. In reality, you got to throw something at the wall and see what sticks, right? But I would just say that start with any of these approaches, but just have an ear to the ground, just listen to feedback and kind of think about it, right? And
Yeah.
interestingly, when we did this program, and we spoke to a couple of researchers, right? We met them at a conference who had kind of successfully submitted bugs and stuff like that, and we kind of asked them, hey, what are your thoughts on the bounty we pay? Is this good enough? Is this too much? Well, nobody says it's too much, but is this too little, etc., etc. But every complaint they had about the program had nothing to do with the money. It was to
Yeah.
do with how we respond, the scope, the triage, etc. They were by and large okay
Yeah.
with the money. It either meant we paid a lot, which I don't think we did,
Mhm.
but the reality is that I think bug bounty hunters do it for the money, but not just for the money. If you have a really good experience with them and you kind of match what everybody else is paying, they're fine,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I just want to add a caveat to your cost plus point. So, you mentioned that one way to go about it is to calculate how much would it be if you were to find this internally, right? I think there's that one is slightly nuanced, right? Because how do you know you couldn't find that issue, right? Like, how
No,
do you
no, no,
know
I'm
if you
with you.
have those skill sets, right?
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I'm just
So
like asking
yeah, yeah.
because we've had this conversation before, right? Where it's just not possible to figure out if our skills are good enough to be able to find certain classes or
No, no, I'm
vulnerabilities
with you. So I
when
think
researchers are.
just to clarify the point I was making, I think I'm with you on that. It's just that you have to come up with a number. You don't have a choice, right? So if you have to
Yeah.
use the heuristics, and
Okay, I
let's say,
see. Yeah.
yeah, let's say you're in, let's say you got a you got a bounty, right? Like for an RC, like let's say it involved like chaining and like a bunch of really like multi-step kind of attack, right? The one thing you can do is you can go to your pen tester and say, hey, if you had to find it, how much effort would it have been? If it says, I don't know, I had to spend like 16 hours on it, and then you say it's $100 an hour, then go give them $1,600, right? It's not
Mm,
perfect, but we know there's no perfect way of doing it, right? So you might
right.
as well kind of use a technique. But I'm with you that I'm not for one saying that hey, it would have been possible to find it, because if it could have, we should have, right? So that's
Yeah,
obviously
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you. I'm just saying using that as a proxy to determine pricing, and not necessarily saying that it can be replaced by the eternal person. But you're right. Like
Yeah.
right. I mean, I think we agree on that. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we spoke about pricing. I'm sorry, we spoke about bounty amounts. We spoke about triage. We spoke about the program. So you said something interesting, right? You said the best program, one of the best programs you see is probably something like Yahoo, which is like star.yahoo.com or whatever. At least that's what it was before. And I think many of the large companies kind of do that as well. Is that the ultimate goal of a bug bounty program? Like, what would you call a mature? Like, what does a mature bug bounty program look like? Right? What's the kind of the end goal for a program?
Google, Facebook, they're all extremely mature programs, right? Yeah, they all pay for impact, right? And they don't pay for things like open redirect and all of those. At least Google does not. I don't know about Facebook, but I think that is really what every program should be aiming for, because again, these programs have been the longest running programs as I know, right? And they pay huge rewards, and their scope is generally pretty wide, and they also constantly ship features, new products and whatnot, right? So, and they have like a full-fledged team that just kind of triages and rewards all day every day. So yeah, if you're looking for some inspiration, I would say Facebook, Google are some good programs.
That also means if your inspiration is Google and Facebook or Google and Meta, that means you'll never get there. So so you'll have to constantly anyway
Yeah,
keep improving your
North
program,
Star,
right? So,
right?
yeah, it's
Yep.
it's an absolute not no. That makes complete sense. Okay, so I think this was great, Anshuman. Anything else you wanted to talk about? These are pretty much all the questions I had.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a few things. So I'm actually curious to know what are your thoughts on end day vulnerabilities and when they get reported to your program. So again, to give context to the viewers, right? Like end day is basically a vulnerability which has been disclosed, but there's like a wait time of n days, so to
Mm.
speak, before it gets disclosed or before it gets fixed, right? So if a vendor has known about an issue in their product, and if the exploit is already available, right, and if it hasn't been fixed for 5 days, that would be a 5-day vulnerability, right? So
Yeah.
oftentimes, like, I think log4j could be an example here, right, where it was I think it was known to pretty much everybody, and we started seeing a bunch of reports, right? And it was just very difficult because the reports were all proving exploitability. The
Mm.
researchers gained access to the data, and then we also knew about it internally. How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think Log4j is a great example because kind of lived through those few months, right? So I think the answer, like everything else, is it depends, right? So if you have a very shallow security team who cannot even figure out if your company is vulnerable to Log4j, then a good trick is to say, hey, if you discover Log4j, we'll give you an even bigger bounty. Maybe we'll give you like $500 instead of like $300, right? So that way you're kind of
Mhm.
outsourcing your internal team's work to them. Obviously, very expensive way of doing it, but when the whole world is looking for Log4j, why would they pick your company, right? So this is kind of incentivizes them to do it. I think on the other hand, if you have a mature security team and you know how to discover Log4j usage in your company and you have a strategy in place, then really any bug bounty program there just becomes noise. And at that point, what you should really do is you should put out like some kind of an announcement or like a blast email if it's a private program. Just say, hey, look, we are aware of this. We are aware of what's happening with Log4j or Log4Shell. This is not something we need bug bounty reports for. So explicitly mark it out of school. Like it's kind of how I would do it. So I would say that it kind of should be a step in your incident management program, saying that if you're
Right.
dealing with like a vendor type vulnerability, then this is how you do it. Now that's for known vulnerabilities, right? So we knew about Log4j
Yeah.
before somebody submitted a report. Sometimes what happens is that somebody submits a report on your application, a valid vulnerability, but the actual underlying vulnerability is in a third party software. And until they fix it, you can't really do much about it. That to me is a little trickier because there you don't know what to
Yeah.
do. You can technically stop using a third party program, but it's not always feasible. So we've handled that in multiple places in the past. If it's a commercial product where we have a relationship with the software seller, then we reach out to them and we encourage them to engage with the researcher. And if they have a bounty program, we encourage them to kind of pay for it. But there were definitely a couple of times where it was in an open source library, and I mean the researcher didn't know it was an open source library. They just found a bug, and we realized it was in an open source library, and we had to kind of do it.
Mm.
So there we just paid the bounty, and we kind of engaged with the open source company to kind of figure out how to change things, and then we gave credit to the bug bounty hunter as well and all that, right? So it's a little tricky, but those are a little harder, and these are things you kind of get better over time, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I have known at least a few instances where we've ended up paying for something that we didn't write or we didn't own. It was like a third party vendor code, and we just didn't know, and we had to pay for it, so we just went. So yeah, no, I think those kind of situations do happen, right? Like it's just what this industry is about. So
And look, in the end, I mean, every time we used to have these bug bounty discussions, like at least in the first few months, we used to have like a committee meeting to decide on bounty amount, because we really had no idea. I mean, we were just like really trying to figure out what the best way to do this, right? And we said, okay, before we automate the process, let's talk. So we kind of build some consensus within the team, and then we'll kind of automate the process. And then a few months later, we didn't have to have these meetings. But the one thing that always came up in these meetings was like, folks, we are here to pay the bounty. The goal is to pay the
yeah,
bounty, right? So there's no point holding back your amount and not paying the right amount, right? Now we need to make sure
yeah,
it's fair, right? We need to make sure that we shouldn't pay bounties based on the username and how popular they are and stuff like that. But there has to be some method to the madness. But at the same time, the end goal should be to pay bounties, right? That's how you
yeah,
encourage more researchers to come and hack on your assets, right? So I think if you have that first principle in mind, the goal of the bounty is not to like reduce the amount of bounty you pay or anything, but it's use it as a means to encourage people to participate without kind of burning your entire cache pile, then that North Star is enough to kind of help you determine how to handle this, right? And if
Yeah.
possible, if you have the means, just be as generous as you can, right? Especially in things like somebody found something in a third party which really affects you. Hey, if it affects you, it affects
Yeah.
you, right? How does it matter if it's in a third party, right? There is
Yeah.
impact, right? So therefore, it kind of makes sense to pay the bounty. But it's not true always. If they found something in Google which impacts you, then maybe Google should pick up the tab, right? So that's I think that there's always going to be like some amount of nuance, but optimized for engaging researchers and being fair to them, I guess, is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything else you wanted to talk about? I know you had a few other things.
I think this is more for like general shout outs to program owners and researchers. I think since I've been on both sides, I just want to give a shout out to all the program owners. I empathize with every one of you, right? Like it's not easy, especially the HackerOne triagers. I don't know how any HackerOne or Bugcrowd, any of these platform, like the folks who triage issues all day every day. I don't know how you do it. Kudos, so much respect. And then for the researchers, like just be mindful, also just be empathetic. Stop asking for updates, right? Like if you trust in a program and if the program owners are not responding back or whatever it is, it is because of something else going on. So yeah, because if a researcher keeps on asking about updates or just kind of cannot stop arguing, that just spoils the whole fun of having a bug bounty program, right? So yeah, that's just something I've experienced, and I just hate when that happens, both as a programmer and a researcher. So yeah, that's it.
Couldn't agree with you more on that. So on that note, that's the end of today's episode.
Cool. I'll pause it.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.